So what gives you conviction that this time is different?
That's Shaq, a partner at Lux Capital. If you haven't heard of Lux, they're a $5 billion fund. They've invested in startups like Databricks, Anduril, Ramp. Shaq has been there for 5 years as a partner. Before that, he was an engineer at NASA and Northrop Grumman. Now meet the founder that's pitching Shaq.
I disagree with the premise that automation has not paid off for the capital expenditure.
That's why he's worked at Google and Apple and founded multiple startups. Vayda Robotics is flipping robotics on its head.
So we're building general purpose robots similar to Tesla or bigger. We're a lot simpler because we're trying to build a form factor that's at the intersection of simplicity and capability. And this allows us to bring the cost down. And
here's one of my favorite questions that Shaq asked.
The question that's going through my head right now is around value capture. In order to build a large generational company, there are two axes most people think about this through. First and foremost,
this part of his framework is understanding, can this actually be a massive company? Check out the next part.
What is ultimately your right to win as you see the entire sort of value chain kind of building across, and what keeps you up at night? What are the competitors that you sort of worry about?
After Hoa left, Shaq shared the answer that he was actually looking for. Check it out.
When I bring up other companies in their broad value chain, the top decile founders are the ones who navigate through all of that. They're obsessed. They're paying attention to every little clip and everything that comes out of it, and they understand exactly what they're building and how it.
And stay to the end because he also shares this.
The founders that most resonate with me are the ones when I bring up other.
I'm Adam O'Donnell. This is the Founder Initiative, and I want you to become one of those founders that most resonates with a VC like Shaq. Now for the pitch.
So we're building general purpose robots similar to Tesla or bigger. We're a lot simpler because we're trying to build a form factor that's at the intersection of simplicity and capability. And this allows us to bring the cost down. And second thing, focusing on third-party developers like physical AI companies and manufacturing integrators instead of doing the entire tech stack ourselves. We're trying to build kind of like the Apple or NVIDIA for a new product class or hardware class.
What are your first thoughts?
Very interesting. Very ambitious. Obviously, the names that you cite, NVIDIA, Tesla, Apple, et cetera, are all like generational companies, right? So it tells me my initial thoughts are he obviously has large ambition and aspirations, trying to build something. There are several questions obviously going through my head that we can kind of dig into. I also get a feeling that you're aware of other attempts in the market, like you mentioned specific names. You also made a couple of comments regarding how you kind of segment between where your capabilities are and where you expect other companies in the startup ecosystem to be playing a role, which shows, I guess, some aspect of self-awareness. I would say some of the things that I'd love to understand are, first of all, why are you building this? And this obviously, excuse me, sorry. In the context of like your background, why is this the thing you're singularly, we always talk about the best founders are missionaries, not mercenaries, right? So trying to understand a bit of like, what is it about this problem that really uniquely draws you to it?
So I think you have to go all the way back to my childhood.
I decided to cut this short by about 20 minutes from this part to where I'm about to take you. If you want to get the full episode, go to the podcast. Link is in the description. The reason I did this is because I want to jump you to the most intense tension in this, because there's a lot of juicy learnings that you can get. Basically, this is when Shaq, the VC, has kind of made an assumption of where things actually are after a bunch of different questions, and then they're wrestling back and forth on like a philosophical view.
Keeps you up at night? What are the competitors that you sort of worry about?
So I don't think I'm worried about competitors fundamentally in this market, because I think that the market is, for the next 10 years, it's a purely value capture market. As long as you build a product that works, there's so many labor domains that you can go after, and it's going to be supply bottleneck. So the only thing that I worry about is our company burns through capital to a point where...
I guess the question is I'll name two companies that are currently highly funded, capitalized, and trying to build intelligence. We'll use physical intelligence and skill as sort of two examples. Where do they sit in this stack?
They're our customer rather than our competitor. So we're not trying to build a foundation model. We're trying to build a hardware platform for them to build on top of, because at the end of the day, they're going to need to monetize their foundation models, and they're going to need to deploy thousands of robots to the market. And right now they're buying robots from researchers, but these robots that they're buying have not been tested for 365-day usage, and they're going to break in the field. And when they need a reliable system to go into the market, we want to establish that reputation that, hey, we're the only viable solution at the price point that they need, with the features that they need, and that's easy for them to build on top of, and they can just scale deployment of their AI algorithms immediately.
So when you think about going back, and this is why this idea of value capture is so important, the defensibility of someone who has built the foundation model has generated, billions, if not trillions of tokens. They've done the thankless work of trying to create the models. They've fundamentally tried to create, or maybe in this case succeeded creating, the idea of the intelligence layer. So when you think about the most valuable part of the stack, my bias is to say that is the most valuable part of the stack. And once that part of the stack has been built, everyone who is currently building hardware today will ultimately become in some ways commoditized, and they're all going to ultimately try and vertically integrate that intelligence layer into their products to make the most compelling value prop for their customers. So I worry about defensibility of ultimately what you're building. Earlier you mentioned you're not necessarily worried about competition, but I'm actually that's sort of where my head is thinking about at the moment. Is everyone becomes a competitor at that world. Everyone who's currently building hardware today, everything from a Roomba all the way up to a Boston Robotics device, everyone will ultimately have to work with one of the small number of companies that will ultimately create embodied intelligence and vertically integrate that into their product.
So I disagree that hardware will be commoditized anytime soon. And I disagree with, and I'll explain my reasoning. But then I think our moat actually comes from multiple layers. Our moat isn't just a hardware layer. Our moat, and our moat is a logistics layer. Our moat is, and we'll dive deeper into that. But first of all, I think that one thing we might actually see is a lot of these foundation models, they might end up being commoditized because we have multiple companies working on these foundation models, from OpenAI, physical intelligence, Skilled AI, and there's also open source ones.
And why do you think they're going to get commoditized beyond just the fact that there's multiple companies working on it? Like maybe a click deeper into the actual limitation around how much physical world data we actually have access to relative to something like text that we had available abundantly on the internet.
So yeah, it's kind of like making a thesis that, hey, one of these companies, they're gonna have exclusive access to all this data, right? And I think that's if they do, so let's say there is only one company that has exclusive access to this data. What we see is these exclusive access only lasts for a couple years maximum. Like I think we haven't seen, like, even DeepSeek or OpenAI, all these companies caught up. And how is a company gonna get exclusive access to all this data exclusively? Either you train from simulation, which is every company will be able to replicate that if we're training from simulation. The other solution is real world deployment. And if they need to scale from real world deployment, that actually benefits us as a company because they need hundreds of thousands of robots to scale into the market, or even thousands. So then we're going to have more demand for our robots, if anything, if it's real world deployment that is the factor that wins. And the third part is, okay, let's say they're a foundation model and any hardware companies can integrate to them. The hardware companies that's going to win are the ones that already established their production line. So they already have those unit economics and scales. Incumbents are going to struggle to enter the market and establish that reliability. And then third is trust. There is a lot of brand credibility that has to be built over many years, because when factories are choosing robots to buy nowadays, they choose KUKA, they choose Fanuc, because there's already this brand credibility. They don't really care about saving $5,000 on a unit, because they end up losing more time on developer. And then the third part is, the third model is support network. We'll have relationships with all these manufacturing integrators throughout the entire US. And for a Chinese company to kind of like establish those support networks, it's going to take them a lot of time, and there's going to be a lot of resistance. And if we're building these moats early on, when these foundation models become ready, think about it. You're a physical AI company. You want to take this foundation model from physical AI, and you need a hardware system to deploy their physical model to. And now you can solve, let's say, busing tables at restaurants. Okay. You're going to need robot support throughout the whole world so you can expand. If you just pick a company that only has like a fulfillment center in the Bay Area, that's going to bottleneck your company. That's why you got to pick us, because we have partners throughout the whole US so that you can scale immediately and not have to worry about hardware as a problem. And that's the value add that we add as a company.
Generally, if we study startups in history, distribution ultimately ends up mattering. And what I greatly worry about is if there isn't a novel value prop that's sort of, and this goes back to kind of the earliest theme, if we can't find the initial wedge or sort of the opportunity in which there's a uniquely differentiated value proposition with the existing market, the ability to disrupt the existing kind of distribution channels that these companies have, it becomes very, very difficult, especially if you don't own the intelligence layer and we're ultimately selling the actual hardware itself. So I guess the feedback or the area that I would want to ultimately see a startup that's sort of pursuing the space is having a very clear wedge in which the differentiation of their value prop is made abundantly clear to the customer, and they're able to leverage that as to kick off that sort of that flywheel and kind of ultimately expand and build from. But the general takeaway here is also, I don't know how much margin there is ultimately to give to build a large enduring business here. Like that is still unclear to me of how a company that's sort of servicing the thing within the part of the ecosystem that you'll be sitting in can ultimately build a large enduring business.
So
and is the biggest
go ahead.
Is the biggest question around that, because defensibility you're still questioning on, and then just the margins of hardware in general are going to be.
Yeah, exactly. I think when you were, so maybe we'll use an example, like you are a customer and you ultimately today pay some employee an hourly wage, right? Because that is ultimately the wallet share you're going after, right? What is the cost of physical labor in the world today? Now, your replacement of this robot is going to be sold. You can come up with novel business models, but there's going to be some sort of capex like purchase that they're ultimately making. Now, the customer, if the cost is too exorbitantly expensive and they can't justify the productivity gains, they're never going to make the switch, right? That's ultimately the sort of floor of what something like this is going to be. So then you're thinking through, okay, well, given the total amount of money I can go after, some of that ultimately needs to feed back to these model providers, right? Some of that ultimately needs to come in from my ability to actually build this hardware. And some of that needs to sort of be priced beyond what it costs me to service it. And that's going to be the margin that I'm going after. My subjective bias at the moment is that the model provider will ultimately capture more of it than the actual ultimate hardware provider itself. So trying to understand if that is the profile of a business here, what ultimately needs to be true in order for this to be worth, tens of billions of dollars, as we kind of talked about, which is generally the type of investments that a venture investor is looking for.
So I don't think the model provider will capture the most value. I think the hardware provider captures a lot of value. So we make about $10,000 in profit per unit we sell. And currently we sell our units for $35,000, which is one of the most affordable.
But what's the payback period now from a physical labor perspective? That's like
Yeah, so it actually it's $3.50. So the payback period is usually less than a year. Because if you actually run like 4 of our robots, we actually have a spreadsheet calculation on this where we actually, by deploying our robots, you actually save versus 4 full-time employees, you actually save about $280,000 a year.
Now, there have been the idea of selling CapEx for automation is not a new concept, right? A lot of customers have historically been pitched this. And I would almost argue the number of customers that have actually seen the ROI benefits of this thus far are not as many as we'd like. And this has historically been one of the frustrations of a lot of automation companies where you provide the vision of, oh, look at the cost savings you ultimately realize, but maintenance, servicing, et cetera, ends up really eating into those margins over time. So what gives you conviction that this time is different?
Well, I think that we've also seen automations have been very successful at saving companies money, right? If you actually look at China and they have lower wage costs, they're almost fully automated in their factories. So I would say I do agree that there is a hesitancy for a lot of companies to switch to full automation, but I disagree with the premise that automation has not paid off for the capital expenditure or the capital investment, because historically it has paid off.
What are some of the automation companies you look up to as having done this incredibly well?
I think ABB and Panic has done this incredibly well because they just built a general purpose arm and they work with a lot of manufacturing integrators. That's the wedge for kind of like, hey, how do we integrate this into these different factories? And then these manufacturing integrators, they use their API and then they just custom program it, and these companies are worth billions of dollars today.
I agree. I think when you think about an ABB though, that company was probably founded in, and I would definitely want to fact check this, but it's probably been around for about 100 years or so.
Yeah.
So it's not historically what I would fall as a venture-backed startup in the sort of duration and timeline, which is also one of the other hardest constraints is it's not just the value creation, it's the time to that value creation mechanism it needs to follow, which historically is the hard part about automation. So I'd love just as you kind of think through this, and this is almost like studying from history, studying from the greats, learning why now is a really important piece, and understanding if there is an opportunity to really create in the customer's mind, not just the fact that automation will at some point benefit them, but the short feedback loop that it's already benefiting them and that they're already seeing those sort of labor savings. That I think is a really key piece to driving meaningful adoption to ultimately build the sort of distribution that you aspire to. Yeah, look, I mean, I'll be just. I think this is a very compelling opportunity. There's gonna be a lot of startups that are converging onto it. I think the startups that ultimately differentiate are ones who can both align incentives in addition to building great technology. I think you're
saying there is a venture fundable opportunity around here.
There could be, there absolutely could be, but I don't think the pattern that has historically led to I'm gonna build a robot and I think it requires innovating on the business model side as much as it involves innovating on the technology side. There's a whole world of like systems integrators that exist today in the world of implementation. And they have done interesting things around asset-based financing where, you pay them essentially almost as if you're paying people on an hourly wage, and they try to, there's creative like financing kind of mechanisms. And I'm happy to talk about certain companies that have done that. But I think success here will be predicated on more than just building amazing technology. And I just sort of wanted to kind of push you in that direction.
No, I think that's what makes Feather unique. We are open to exploring different business opportunities. And I think that our entire differentiator is we're very unique in our go-to-market. And that's why we're working with manufacturing integrators as our wedge. And we're going to figure out how do we align incentives. So I think that's...
and those LOIs, are those from integrators?
Yes, those are from integrators as well as physical AI startups.
Yeah.
So
that's great.
That's really cool. I mean, that's confirmation. Hoa just left the room, and Shaq and I are about to have a one-on-one conversation about the pitch.
What I always tell my founders to do is like, rather than starting in PowerPoint, start in a Word doc and write 3 bullet points. That is literally it. Just write 3 bullet points. And those 3 bullet points are like, if the person on the other side gets anything out of this discussion, they should know these 3 things. Anything else that they got, that's all bonus. But like the only 3 things that matter are the 3 bullet points that I'm writing here.
And that can vary based on whatever the business is.
Exactly. In this case, like
what would it be for Hoa?
Yeah, it's a good question. One would be the future of robotics. The limitation on robotics will not be a function of the complexity of the hardware. It'll be because of the simplicity of the hardware, right? That's one of his bullet points. And it took me a bit to get that out of him, to be clear. I had to really work there. And at least this is my understanding of what he wants to build. I think he thinks that the figures of the world are almost over-engineering for this like absolutely perfect humanoid. And his belief is that you can do it much, much more cheaply using more scrappy creative form factors. The like one arm on the roller cart that he showed us, like the entire thing, my guess is he mentioned he could sell it with $10,000 margins, which means his all-in costs are probably in the order of like $20,000, right? That is a order of magnitude probably less than these other companies that are trying to build this, right? So he thinks that scrappy, like cheap hardware with just flood the world with them, put 1 million of these devices everywhere, collect as much data as you possibly can in the real world, and that will continue to further improve robotics. Like that is one of his bullet points, right? His other bullet points are probably around like you have to absolutely build an amazing developer experience. Like you have to make sure that folks are coming in. And again, these things were implicit, not explicit. And unfortunately, most people don't have the attention span to pay attention to actually draw those out of people, right? So the feedback to him is figure out what those 3 bullet points are, make them incredibly explicit, and make sure at the very least, I might disagree even after hearing those 3 bullet points. That is totally fine. That is ultimately the world we live in, right? But it is a mistake on his part if he walks out of that, and I can't articulate what those 3 things were.
The more that I see interviews like this and just being previously a VC, it's like there's something that VCs are assuming about you, and those 3 need to speak to that. And I'm curious, in Hua's case, what would be the 3 things that when you're describing his opportunity to another partner? Yeah, I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
it's I like to call this it's the cocktail description, right? So oftentimes when you're at a networking event or you're seeing a bunch of other VCs, you'll start trading names of companies. And you'll be like, oh, did you see? Oh, that's the company that's building, Scale AI for robotics, or that's the company that's building X for Y, And if you walk out of a pitch and you can't necessarily articulate like, what is the like cocktail version of that company, then to me, it probably means that the person didn't really understand what you were building, right? So his sort of cocktail description, I would say, is commodity hardware with a great like developer SDK is sort of what I believe he's trying to build. I probably am not doing it full justice or appreciation of the nuance.
It's about making it easy for you to be able to articulate that at the end of the day.
We're all playing this game of telephone, right? And how do I then tell the next person what it is? And then that creates the virality or that, did you see that this company's out there and what are they doing again? Oh yeah, they're doing this for this. Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So that I think is the markings of a really good pitch. When everyone walks out of the call and they know more or less exactly what you're trying to do. The founders that most resonate with me are the ones when I bring up other companies in their broad value chain, rather than being dismissive or saying that, oh, we're going to like, I think it's important to understand incentives. Ultimately, there's a famous Charlie Mungerism that you show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And I think that is exceptionally true in startups. So based on how much a company has raised, based on the type of talent they've attracted, based on what they've publicly said. There's a lot to show you there about what ultimately their aspirations are and what they plan on building. And the top decile founders are the ones who navigate through all of that. They're obsessed. They're paying attention to every little clip and everything that comes out of it. And they understand exactly what they're building and how it fits into the broad ecosystem. So there's an aspect of studying history. It's like learning kind of who's come before me, what were their assumptions that they made, what ended up being proven true, what ended up being proven false. But I find that those founders almost always are the ones that I get most excited about spending time with, the ones that are obsessed with their ecosystem, their value chain, and have studied the sort of history patterns that have led them to there.
Interesting. For some reason, I'm thinking about like the first Antarctica expedition where there was multiple people who had tried before. And it's easy to be the one now is like, we're different just because we're smarter and we're better. But you're saying it would be much more interesting to you to say, hey, these 3 expeditions failed here and we studied where they went wrong.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. It's like, oh, and also they probably made this assumption because based on his map, he would have been told that the sea levels were going to be explicitly this level at this point, and so they actually try to navigate around it. But in reality, actually, what I believe to be true is that you want to go through the sea level because there's some. I'm trying to run this analogy. I'm sorry if it's not working.
No, it's you're killing me.
but that's the point exactly. Yeah. I think it's the ability to be able to study what's come before you, understand why they may have done what they've done, and learn from that versus dismissive.
That is good. This is just blowing up my mind right now because I'm like that. It makes so much sense because I think in the same reason that the best startups are the ones that learn from their mistakes. How better is it to learn from those?
There's a really good example of a company called General Magic. I don't know if you've ever, there's a great documentary on them. I would recommend very few founders who think of today's era probably would have ever learned about this, but the iPhone was invented before the iPhone, right? It had everything you could have possibly asked for. They had access to essentially infinite amount of capital. They had the absolute best of the best from a talent perspective. They were working in like what is a huge market. So like if you were to draw the like check of everything, like this company should have succeeded. We should all be using a General Magic phone at the moment, yet we're not. And
what year was it?
This probably would have been just before, probably like early 2000s. So like maybe about 3 to 4 years, probably too early. And ultimately that was the conclusion, right? Timing is a bit of everything. And they ended up having to vertically integrate beyond what a startup should have, right? Everything from like setting up the telecommunications infrastructure to actually building the device to rolling out the operating system. There was just too much to be done, and not one company should have been taking that whole thing on, right? But that's an example of something where the ambition is important, but it's also scaled ambition relative to the opportunity and kind of knowing what it was. Now, Steve Jobs would come around several years later, knowing exactly what resources he had access to and was able to build the greatest consumer product of all time. So that is like a small example of kind of what I'm touching on, where it's, if I'm
They scaled because of X, Y, and Z, and the reasons were outside infrastructure. Now that's been solved.
Yeah.
If you're Apple years later, and we're still, if they had just taken the same product but built it now for the most part, which
That's
is
right.
what Apple
That's right. So,
but it's understanding that context, and it's understanding the actual learnings that happened before, where people were trying to sell a product.
totally. I rarely have heard an idea or a pitch that I'm like, that is the first time I've ever heard that. Like, we like to think about venture as being so disruptive and novel, but I think it's not so much the idea being disruptive and novel. It's the operationalizing of that idea that finally the timing is everything, right? The difference between being early and being wrong, unfortunately, there isn't one, right? Right. And that I think is an important lesson for founders that are ultimately trying to build something.
What are you excited about in hardware that is changing? Like, obviously the AI component of it, but like you touched on how you thought the real opportunity was around the intelligence layer versus the hardware. Is there anything else you can tell about where you see things going in the next 5 years, these shifts to help founders who are building around that?
Yeah, look, I think this is probably like one of the, if not the single most exciting place folks can be building in today. So
Hardware.
Generalized physical intelligence, I should say. I think one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves, going back to this theme we just discussed, is how do we make sure we're not too early? Well, it's important to like to watch very closely what is actually happening. So in the world of large language models, we had access to all of human history, right? And that is this beautiful thing called the internet. Everything that was uploaded, all of human knowledge was basically in a single place. Now, the incentives that led to that is that there was no cost to create information and there was no cost essentially to distribute information. So it had this inherent sort of quality where everyone just started putting everything on there. And these amazing research labs all came around and realized we have access to this. It's not unique that we have access to it. Everyone else has access to it too. But if we take it and we focus singularly on building these amazing capabilities, we have these amazing models that we have today. Now, if we look at physical labor as a parallel to that, we do not have that same access. We don't have the internet of robotics data today. So as I talk with great entrepreneurs and I ask, like where is your conviction coming from? There's almost like an inherent assumption that we have the foundation model for robotics today. But the question there is, there's a lot of data that still needs to be generated there. And there's not just the data that needs to be generated. What is the incentive for generating that data? Every time you run some sort of telerobotics or you run some sort of operation, there is a cost associated with that, right? Let's use self-driving really quick as a counterexample. So in self-driving, you have the two largest players that were basically being funded by balance sheets that were not venture funded balance sheets, like Google, who was basically, funding the cost of Waymo, and, General Motors, who would then go on to fund, the cost of Cruise. Amazon has their own version in a company called Zoox. But this was a game meant for titans because they understood that to create the data required at scale, you needed essentially access to a massive balance sheet to go and do that because there was no incentive to do that. Now, who is the counter orthogonal point of view here? It's Tesla, right? The vision that Tesla has is I have already equipped all of these cars that are already driving out there on the road with computer vision, and they can be a vehicle, no pun intended, to collect a bunch of visual data. So if I can scale that up in a way, maybe I can arrive at the same fully self-driving, world that these others have tried to build, but through an incentive that looked very, very different than paying people essentially to go and drive a car around San Francisco all day, right? Now let's play that forward in robotics. The area in robotics that, who ultimately today you've got a lot of companies that want to go to lower cost labor countries and ultimately provide some capability to allow people to like operate robots all day, every day. Now, even if you do that for, months, years, etc., the ability to recreate the internet scale data is unlikely to be true, right? We need some sort of incentive breakthrough. So the founders I'm really excited about are ones who are cleverly thinking about this. How do you create this data? How do you label this data? How do you ultimately provide this data? Whether you want to be a research lab yourself, whether you want to sell into these research labs. But as we can embody that level of intelligence into these models, that's where all of a sudden things get very, very exciting. And for me, one of the pieces is like timing. Timing is everything.
Whew, because the biggest challenge right now is getting the data.
I'm not expecting to be right about everything, but this is a point of view that I have, and I, intellectually want to be challenged on what assumptions has he seen through his experience that would then push me to think that, oh, actually, we will get to that data, or we're going to have some massive algorithmic breakthrough, or we're going to scale telerobotics in a way we've never scaled it before.
It makes a lot of sense because the challenge is not can you build a thing that works as a robot. It never has really been. It's can you understand all the different variables of things? And we have no way of tracking that right now because there's not a bunch of stuff on our bodies as we do all the things throughout our day. So that is like siloed, dark information.
That's right.
And that's the biggest thing that AI has done is that we already had it. It was all like for the internet, for all those writing problems.
We had all knowledge work, right? And I think this is the most important piece is if you want to build a domain specific robot, which is something I was really kind of pushing him on, I think the amount of scale of data you need to collect in that domain is not as large as the internet scale. Where you can build purpose-built robots much more quickly than we want to build a generalizable robot, a robot that can essentially zero shot a new task that it has never seen before. But the way a human would look at an object and say, oh, I can pick it up with this much force, and this is ultimately how it'll move. That generalizability it's ambitious. It's what we all want. We want to build physical world robots with that. But that is not a variable that you can or that is a variable. It's not a constant. You can just like kind of plug into your equation and say, yep, that's solved. Let's move on.
That makes a lot of sense. It's the same problem. Like I always try to automate any steps in my current workflow, but the problem is that I'm constantly changing. So if I don't have a way to, so like the automations fail and break, it's almost like we can get a robot to do the same thing, no problem.
That's right.
But the variability, which is, it's like the Waymo and then there's like a kid and they're a different size and they didn't have that in the algorithm.
That's right.
And you just can't have it. And that's the problem.
Yeah. And this is why not all use cases are the same. This is what makes it exciting. So one way to think about this is, when you are AWS and you're standing up some sort of cloud server, you will sell your customers what are called the nines of availability, right? So it's 99.99999% available, which means that over the course of a year, you might have single digit number of minutes of downtime, right? And most people are okay with that. They know it might not occur linearly, it might just get distributed across the year, but like that is expected downtime. Self-driving is one of those use cases where if you go wrong, it's existential, right? So you have to make sure the nines of availability are there. Not all physical labor robotic use cases have that same shared quality. There are some that could be down, your janitorial robot could potentially go down more frequently, and that's not mission critical. There are other robots where they need as much of the nines availability as possible. So that aspect of how much data is required, how much of those sort of corner cases do I need to train on and build into the model, that will vary greatly, which is why it's important to know what is the use case I'm ultimately going after, and then what is then the data collection required to service that use case.
Boom. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was amazing. I'm Adam O'Donnell. Thanks for listening to the Founder Initiative. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. This is way more than just a podcast. It's a community of founders where we're dedicated to focusing on helping founders hit product market fit, get funded, and stay up to date. Boom.